So there's a lot of stuff here, and sometimes I think what I want to do is I want to focus on the big picture. There are a few sentences in here that are kind of strange and awkward, but if you could summarize his basic point. What is Paul's basic point? He talks about in chapter 8, we Christians need to be willing to deny themselves for the sake of others. And what does Paul say he does in chapter 9 as an example of how this works in real life?
As others so that we can reach out to them,
Okay.
Identify with them.
Okay. What else? That's true, he does. Gail?
In my view, after I read this this morning, the word he switched his whole focus in 14 and 12 to the gospel. Even so, the Lord has commanded. So I see him as switching from, or not switching, but showing a big comparison is don't do all of these things because the gospel of the grace comes first. It's not righteousness or justification based on all these other things we do. It's strictly the gospel of Christ.
Well, okay, in verses 1 to 14, Paul gives lots of analogies and lots of examples. What is it that Paul could ask for, that he could ask for the Corinthian church in verses 1 to 14 that he doesn't ask for? Payment. So what does that mean? Payment for what?
For preaching the gospel.
Yeah, he could ask for a salary because he was their pastor. Like he was there for a year and a half. So Paul did not ask for any money at all. Paul was bivocational. He built tents, he worked with leather, he was a tent maker guy. He didn't take any money from the Corinthian church. And that was his thing. It doesn't have to be everyone's thing, but to him, in his context, that was an important thing. But that's not to say that every pastor should not get paid. It's an example for Paul's case because of who Paul was and what Paul went through and the things that are being whispered about Paul. To him, it was important that he take that step so that no one would have any ground to say anything bad about him. And we'll get into that in a minute. The point seems to be that Paul's willing to deny himself unimportant things for the sake of others. He's willing to sacrifice a little for the sake of other people. He talked about doing that in 1 Corinthians 8. If it offends other Christians who don't have as good of understanding of what matters and what doesn't, if it offends other Christians for him to eat meat sacrificed to idols, then he just won't do it for their sake. And here he says another example he gives is, I don't charge anything. I don't ask for money. I don't expect money. I don't ask for any compensation for preaching. And there's a reason for that. And then he goes on and talks what are the examples he gives in verses, let's see. Yep, I'm in the wrong chapter. That's why nothing actually makes any sense. In verses 19 to 23, what are the examples that he gives here? What's verses 19 to 23 about?
He's talking about how he's just saying that the people he preaches to, he makes himself like them, so he can relate to it and share the gospel.
Okay, does anyone else have any thoughts? Peter, I keep confusing you with your brother, I don't know why. Samuel said that he accommodates himself to whoever he's speaking to for the sake of the gospel. Does anyone else have any thoughts about what he's saying in verses 19 to 23? Agree, disagree?
Well, it's the same thing when I said, I became a servant to all that I might win more of them. To the Jews, I became a Jew. To those under the law, I became one under the law. To the Gentiles, I became a Gentile, act like a Gentile. To those outside the law, as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. To the weak, I became weak, that I might win the weak. So he went on in that way that he...
But doesn't that compromise the word in his actions and deeds? Because the Jews don't believe in Jesus.
Yeah, he did that in a certain way. He when he says that he made himself like a Jew, or he followed the law for the sake of those who are under the law, he did it in a certain way, and we'll talk about that in a second. I want to circle back to talk about why Paul's even doing this. I think the big thing to remember before we go back, I want to talk about Paul and how he came to faith, the things that are driving him to do these things now. Paul's point is, if you're a Christian, you need to be willing to deny yourself unimportant things for the sake of other people. That might mean other people in your congregation. Maybe they'll be led astray if you do certain things you could do, but you're not going to do them for the sake of people in your church. Or it could be for unbelievers. Maybe you should be willing to give up certain things, and we'll talk about what that means, certain unimportant things, so that you'll be able to speak truth into someone's life and maybe be the instrument God uses to bring them to Christ. But it's the same point. Be willing to deny yourself unimportant things for the sake of other people. And you, as you think about your life, that could look like many different things, because I don't know, I don't know your life, you don't know mine, I don't know the people you know, I don't know the family members you know, the friends you know, the neighbors you know. So the basic principle, you can apply it in many different ways. Now, Paul applies it in a specific way because of who he is and the baggage that he's carrying around with him. That's not going to be our baggage. But Paul's baggage is Paul's, and that's why he's acting the way he's acting. So I want to go back to Acts chapter 9 and sort of maybe remind ourselves of how Paul came to faith and what the stuff that he's been dealing with, and the things that are sort of following him, the little clouds of gossip and rumor that follow him around because of who he is and what he's done. We all do things wrong. God forgives us when we confess our sin, but sometimes we still have temporary consequences of our sin. We're forgiven, but now we have to deal with the fallout from the bad decisions we made and the things we did. It doesn't mean we're not forgiven, but it means, there are consequences for doing something silly, and we have to deal with that. For Paul, he continued to deal with who he was before he was saved. It's this sort of cloud that followed him everywhere. So let's go back to Acts chapter 9. Some of you, this might be really familiar. Others, you might not have heard it before. So Acts chapter 9 is a good place to go. How did Paul, what was Paul before he was saved? What was he? What was his social standing? What was his status? What kind of stuff was he up to before he was saved? Does anyone know off the top of your head?
He killed Christians. He was a martyr for his cause.
Okay. Yeah, Paul, what are you going to say, Tim?
I was going to say he was the Pharisee of Pharisees. In other words, he followed the law to the letter, and people that taught against the law, he persecuted.
Yeah, so if you look in Philippians, I believe it's Philippians, Paul talks about gives sort of a biography of his background. He was raised as a Pharisee, a really devout, really religious Pharisee, like the Pharisees in the New Testament that Jesus dealt with. These are guys who had a fake understanding of the Old Testament. Instead of just taking the Old Testament at face value, they had all these barnacles of tradition encrusted up over the Old Testament that basically made them have a different view of God and a different view of what it means to be a believer and how your relationship with God should be. It's really legalistic. It's all external, not much internal. And that's why Jesus had such conflict with the Pharisees. And that's who Paul was. He was raised in that. He was really good. He's a really devout Pharisee. But that's his baggage. That's where he comes from. And Paul, when he's sort of a junior member of the council in Jerusalem, you see him in Acts chapter 7 when Stephen's stoned to death. Paul is there watching with a smile on his face. He didn't participate, but he's there, he's watching, and he seems to be really happy that this is going on, because to him, Christians are heretics, right? They say this criminal Jesus is the Messiah, and the Pharisees and the religious leaders, for different reasons, they think that Jesus is a heretic. So Paul thinks this is good that Stephen's being killed. And Paul is really upset because this heresy, what he thinks is a heresy, is going everywhere into all these synagogues, sort of infecting everyone. So Paul's really upset. He's going to go to these synagogues and he's going to speak the truth, and he's going to do more. He's going to get these people who are spreading this heresy, he's going to haul them down to face trial in Jerusalem. And maybe some of them will be executed if the Romans allow it. So Paul is not, don't picture Paul as like some cartoon evil guy, sitting in a basement and going, ready to just kill all the Christians. He really thinks he's doing a good thing. I mean, there's heresy, and we need to stop it, because people are going to be led astray. So that's why Paul is going off to, he's been commissioned by the church in Jerusalem, by the council in Jerusalem, to go out and to go find these people and identify them and bring them to justice. In Acts chapter 9 is where this sort of takes place. This is where you see Paul is sort of deputized, in those Western movies where they bring in a guy and they deputize him to go out and take care of the, to take care of the issue. Paul has been deputized. He has this little gold star that says sheriff on his shirt, and he's sent off to go take care of the issue in Damascus in Acts chapter 9. But Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any belonging to the way, which is the Christians, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. So that's what he wants to do. I put this map up here, and I intentionally made it, well, this is actually a map of Bible lands today. I intentionally made it big so you can actually see the Mediterranean. Paul is here in Jerusalem, okay? Paul is here where my green dot is. He wants to go to Damascus in Syria to go bring to the synagogues, find out who these Christians are. They're everywhere, but especially in Syria, and he wants to bring them back. And so Paul wants to go to Damascus, which is here. Damascus is here. Jerusalem is here. So he wants to go up here to Damascus, which is still in Syria. It's the capital today. He wants to find these guys. He wants to bring them back. What happens to Paul on the way to Damascus? As he's driving on the highway in his minivan, what happens to Paul? Yeah, Jesus confronts Paul directly with a bright, shining light. We know Paul falls off his horse. He hears the Lord speaking to him. He hears Jesus speaking to him from heaven, saying, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" And the Lord speaks to him. He tells him to enter the city, and someone will come see him when he's there. The Lord speaks to a disciple named Ananias. He tells Ananias to go find Paul, the guy who's been killing Christians and hauling him off to jail. He wants him to go find him. He wants him to go talk to him. He wants him to go heal the guy. He says in verse 15, Ananias doesn't want to go. I wonder why. I wouldn't want to go. In verse 15, we read, "The Lord said to him, 'Go, for he's a chosen instrument of mine to carry my name before the Gentiles and the kings and the children of Israel. For I will show him how much he must suffer for the sake of my name.'" So Ananias goes, he speaks to him, and immediately Paul has been blinded since this time. It's like he has massive cataracts. He's literally blinded, and something like scales fall from Paul's eyes as soon as Ananias speaks to him and laid hands on him and said what he said. And Paul is immediately, I think he has believed in Jesus since the incident on the road, but now he's baptized and was strengthened, and he stays in Damascus. What does he do in Damascus? What's he up to as soon as he's better?
Started proclaiming Jesus
Where?
in the synagogue.
Now, what do you think the Jewish people think about that? He's the guy with the letters from the high priest saying he can go into these exact same places and find Christians and haul them away. Now he shows up, and they're expecting him, and they're all happy, and he says, Jesus is the Messiah, and he's the Son of God, and you all need to worship him. They're probably really mad, really angry. Probably getting on the phone to the high priest as soon as he leaves, figuring out what on earth who is this guy? What's happened to him? This guy is a Christian. So the Jewish community really, really hates him. Verse 21, all who heard him were amazed and said, "Is not this the man who made havoc in Jerusalem of those who called upon this name? And has he not come here for this purpose, to bring them bound before the chief priests?" But Saul increased all the more in strength and confounded the Jews who lived in Damascus by proving that Jesus was the Christ. So Paul has a lot of learning, a lot of education, but it was all bound in by these guardrails of the system that he grew up in. And so now that he realizes the system he grew up in was wrong, now he's using all his education and all his intellect, and now he's channeling it in a direction, in a Jesus direction. So no matter how much the people in the synagogues, the Jewish people, try and dispute with him and have arguments with him, or public interactions with him, he keeps winning these arguments, and they can't prove that he's wrong. And his whole point is Jesus is the Messiah. He's the one from the scriptures, and they can't prove him wrong. So what do they decide to do?
Kill him, or fought against him.
Yeah, they want him. They said, well, we can't defeat him in arguments, so we're just going to kill him. We're just going to kill him. Some things never change. So they want him gone. So they plot to kill him. Verse 23, when many days had passed, the Jews plotted to kill him. Their plot became known to Saul. They were watching the gates day and night in order to kill him. But his disciples put him in a basket and lowered him from a window on the city wall so he could get away. Okay, so Paul leaves. Where's Paul supposed to go? Where does he go? If you're Paul, you've lived in Jerusalem for a very long time. You've been raised there. You've been taught there by one of the chief leaders of the Pharisees. You joined the Christian community in Damascus when you were supposed to be on your way to arrest them. You've been preaching, and you're there for a while. And now the Jews want to kill you, and you escape by the skin of your teeth. So where do you go if you're Paul? What are you supposed to do? Where does he go? He goes back to Jerusalem, which is probably not the best place to go, but where else is he supposed to go? It's home. What else is he supposed to do? So he goes back to Jerusalem, and he attempted to join the disciples. How did that work? No, yeah, they're like, no. I understand. I wouldn't want him. I'd be kind of worried too. So who is there who sort of steps in and vouches for Paul? Barnabas. Barnabas is a really nice guy. Now, Barnabas doesn't even know him. Verse 27, but Barnabas took him and brought him to the apostles and declared to them how on the road he'd seen the Lord who'd spoke to him, and how at Damascus he'd preached boldly in the name of Jesus. So Barnabas doesn't even know this guy, but Barnabas is a really, really nice man. Barnabas is nicer than me, probably. He's a really nice guy, warm-hearted guy. He's always willing to take a chance on someone. So he takes a chance on. Now I have the ABBA song stuck in my head, actually. I don't know why. Don't judge me. But anyway, I've only heard other people listening to it. So he takes a chance on Paul. He vouches for him. So now Paul is in Jerusalem, and he's preaching boldly in the name of Jesus. And what happens eventually in Jerusalem? Paul is a really good speaker. I mean, he's really, really good. He's a great evangelist. He is great because he has so much education, but he can speak to normal people. He's not like a guy who has lots of education and only 2% of his audience can understand what he's saying. He can actually communicate to normal people really well. And so what happens in Jerusalem eventually? Yeah, they want to kill him again. There's a different group of people. They want to kill him. Okay, so now Paul can't stay in Jerusalem. So what does the church in Jerusalem do for Paul? He can't stay there. He's so effective that everyone wants to kill him. So what does he do? What do they do for him?
They just send him back to Tarsus.
They send him to Tarsus. And then we don't hear about him for 2 chapters. He's there for a while, years. We have no idea what he's doing there. He's probably preaching and teaching, but it's not like some hot button place where everyone's going to want to kill him. We don't see him again until chapter 11. Does anyone know in chapter 11 why Paul suddenly pops back into the picture? What is going on in chapter 11 that makes Paul appear back in the picture? Does anyone know off the top of
25, Barnabas went to Tarsus to look for Saul, and when he had found him, he brought him to Antioch.
Okay, Antioch is
They met with the church and talked.
Antioch is in Syria. Antioch is here. This is Jerusalem, down here. This is Damascus. He was in Damascus first, went back to Jerusalem. They want to kill him. He goes back. He goes to Tarsus, which for some reason I can't.
It's right up there at the top of the water.
This is Antioch.
Now over, up, right there where the little dots are.
No, that's the Tarsus Mountain. That's the Taurus Mountains. Okay, I forget where Tarsus is. It doesn't matter. The point is, Antioch is here. That's the church where Paul becomes the second pastor. A whole bunch of people, mostly Gentiles, are coming to faith in Antioch. Huge things going on. It's amazing. The apostles down in Jerusalem, they send Barnabas to go up there and take a look at what's going on and take over the church because they really need someone there because it's growing like crazy. Barnabas gets there. He's there for a little while in Acts chapter 11. Barnabas says, I can't do this by myself. Way too much to do. Way too much to do. I need help. And then Barnabas says, who can I get to help me? Wait a minute. I know this guy. He's been off the beaten path for a little while, but I'm going to get him, and he's going to come help me. So he gets Paul. They come to Antioch, and that's the base that Paul uses where they first go out on their first missionary journey. So I did all that for a reason. That's where Paul comes from. He's got a whole bunch of people who hate him for different reasons. He has Jewish people who really hate him because he's a traitor. Everywhere he goes, he's infamous. Jewish people really hate him. He's got Gentiles because he doesn't act like an orator. He's not philosophical. He's a Jewish guy from a Jewish background, so he's not quite like them. And Jewish people hate him because he thinks Jesus is the Messiah. And you have all this stuff going on. And Acts chapter 18 tells us, if you've never read it, Acts chapter 18, verses 1 to 18, tell us what happened in Corinth. This is a snapshot of what happened in Corinth. Paul didn't have a very easy time. Acts 18, 1 to 18, after this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. That's when he first arrives. He found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. And he went to see them, and this is a guy who's come from Rome. Rome is here. There's a lot of travel going on here. A guy from Rome, he finds him in Corinth, which is here. So people are traveling all over this is the Eastern Mediterranean. In fact, this is where I was stationed, actually, in Sicily, a little after Paul. But people are all over the place, traveling everywhere. There's like a cosmopolitan kind of thing going on here. Like there's people from everywhere all over the place. So Paul gets to Corinth. He finds these two people. He went to see them, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for they were tent makers by trade. He reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and tried to persuade Jews and Greeks. When Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul was occupied with the word, testifying to the Jews that the Christ was Jesus. And when they opposed and reviled him, he shook out his garments and said to them, your blood be on your own heads. I am innocent. From now on, I'll go to the Gentiles. And he left there and went to the house of a man named Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. His house was next door to the synagogue. Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed in the Lord. That was a good convert. Together with his entire household, and many of the Corinthians, hearing Paul, believed and were baptized. The Lord said to Paul one night in a vision, do not be afraid, but go on speaking, and do not be silent, for I am with you, and no one will attack you to harm you, for I have many in this city who are my people. He stayed 1 year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. That's how long he stayed. And now we have the circumstances of him leaving. But when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews made a united attack on Paul and brought him before the tribunal. They brought him before the civil magistrate, saying, this man is persuading people to worship God contrary to the law. But when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, if it were a matter of wrongdoing or vicious crime, O Jews, I would have reason to accept your complaint. But since it's a matter of questions about words and names in your own law, see to it yourselves. I refuse to be a judge of these things. He basically says, this is a weird Jewish thing. What do I care? You guys need to go to your synagogue and figure it out. It's nothing to do with me. It's like bringing a church complaint before the city of Olympia. They're going to be like, what is this? What's have to do with me?
Didn't, when they brought Jesus before Herod, wasn't that the same attitude? It's like, this is a church thing. It's not...
Yeah, they brought him before Pilate, and Pilate said, take him to Herod. What do you want me to do? So it's the same kind of thing. He doesn't even let them talk. He's just like, this has nothing to do with me. Moving on. So he drove them from the tribunal, and they all seized Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue, and beat him in front of the tribunal, but Gallio paid no attention to any of this. So this didn't work out very well for the Jewish people in Corinth. They thought they really had him, and all the guy did was dismiss it without even hearing the case. After this, Paul stayed many days longer, then took leave of the brothers and set sail for Syria. That's Paul in Corinth. That's what happened in Corinth. So Paul's got a whole bunch of the point I make by all this is Paul has a lot of baggage hanging around him that makes him take the stands that he does. Paul has a lot of baggage hanging around him. Why do you think Paul would not want to take money for his preaching? What's that?
I don't think that they would believe him. If he was taking money for what he was preaching, then it would become like a circus act type thing.
Okay.
If he did it of his own free will without taking anything, then it was coming from his heart.
I would have thought that money was his
Main motive.
Yeah, Paul talks about how people deserve to be paid. He talks about he takes an Old Testament quotation, don't muzzle the ox that treads out the grain. Even when you're using an animal, you feed it, because it earns food while you're working it. And he uses many examples. He talks about I have a right to request money. I'm just not going to. I'm not going to request money. And one of the reasons probably is I have to think there's something going on in his relationship with the population in Corinth that to avoid any appearance of you're just in it for the money, because he used to be a Jew but now he's not, and he's going around everywhere preaching and everything, I think just to avoid this appearance of I'm in it I'm a televangelist, I'm in it for the money. Send me $50 and I'll bless a prayer shawl and send it to you. He just decides I'm not going to have anything no money from the church in Corinth. There's something going on there that makes him say that. In verse 13, verse 12, nevertheless, we have not made use of this right, but we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. So he just decides that he's not going to do it. He's not going to ask for money. There's something swirling around that makes it enough of a question in his mind that he simply doesn't ask for it.
Tyler?
Yeah.
In all of his missionary journeys, does he take money anywhere from anyone?
I'm not sure. I would guess, off the top of my head, I would guess no, because he was bivocational the entire time. He took money for a collection and brought it to the church in Jerusalem. He's sort of a courier in that way, but I don't know. I don't think the New Testament tells us that he actually ever took a salary. But for him, it was important to not do that. Think of all the Jewish people going around talking about him. What do you think they're saying about him? All the pious Jewish people who think he's a traitor, and now he's going around and preaching and making converts and everything else. What kind of things do you think they might be saying about him?
They might be, not wanting him to succeed now that he's a turncoat, so they're probably going to try and, ruin his testimony. Maybe saying, you can't trust him, he's still one of us, maybe they're lying.
Or maybe he's just in it for the money. But he has such a cloud of baggage hanging over him from who he used to be and the things he did that he even has Christians who probably still don't trust him. Who still remember what he used to do and who still don't really trust him, even if they might say they do. And he has Jewish people who really don't like him, who are interested in trying to inoculate people against him by telling people about this guy. Even when Paul's arrested in Jerusalem in Acts 21, the people in Jerusalem who are there for the Passover, they say, this is the guy who's turning the world upside down. It's the guy, and here he is. He is a huge reputation, a bad reputation among certain people. And it's such a cloud that for him, it's enough of a cloud that to avoid even the appearance that he's in it for something other than the gospel, he won't take any money, because to him, that's how important this is. Yeah, Andrew.
It does seem that, I would just nuance that a little bit, Tyler. It does seem that Corinth is a bit of a special case, because later on in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 8, he says, I've robbed other churches to serve you. And so he almost gives the idea that he's actually taking support from other churches in order to be able to serve the Corinthians without charge. He's saying that sarcastically, robbed, meaning he's taking money from other churches in order to serve the Corinthians. And so he has, there's a reason why both of the books to the Corinthians are much more kind of pessimistic than he's not able to talk as kindly. He has to use a lot of sarcasm and kind of bluntness with the Corinthians than he does with the other churches, because it seems like for whatever reason there was a lot of stuff going on in Corinth where people were just very suspicious, and so Paul is having to tread much more carefully with them than he does with some of the other churches.
So if he was traveling, how did he afford to do all that?
Well, I think that he is bivocational, so he does get money by making tents and probably repairing and stuff everywhere he goes. He could sort of shut up shop everywhere he goes, and he probably, at least at some of the churches, it seems, from especially what Andrew said, which didn't occur to me when I answered that before, he's probably taking some, some offering is given for him at perhaps some of the churches to probably help him along. But there is certainly something going on in Corinth, that some weird thing. It's a church with a lot of problems. Claudia, what were you going to say?
Well, I was just going to say that I also remember reading in one of the Gospels, I don't remember which one, that there's some times where he was well off, meaning that probably he would do that, and other times where he was starving. That, he had no money at all. And so I think it just depended on where it was at. As far as the Corinthians, that was just, the people themselves were not good people to begin with. They looked for the bad in Corinth, if I understand.
Yeah, there's, every church is different. There are some churches where, every church is just different. The mix of people and the personalities and the stuff. So all churches are a little bit different. This is just a church with a lot of nitpicking, a lot of factions, a lot of infighting. It's just a messed up church. It just really is. And if you've ever been in a really messed up church, hopefully none of you are thinking, yes, I'm in one right now. But if you've ever been in a really messed up church, you know what I'm talking about. It's just like, my goodness, you guys. My goodness.
It doesn't come to be a Christian church as bad as they were. I'm listening to a podcast that's talking about Corinthians, and it just amazes me that Paul was able to even hold a church together in that particular area.
Gail, were you going to say something?
Question. When he was a Pharisee and doing all the killing of the Christians, was he paid? Did the Pharisees pay him? How did he get his money then? And I'm wondering if he got income from somewhere, if he didn't want to use that for them to link over, whether he took money to kill us, make a connection there.
I don't know. I don't know how he got his income when he was a Pharisee, but I think it's safe to say that he was cut off. It's like having a good job and then suddenly walk out and saying, I'm done with this, goodbye, and you walk out the door and you're done. You have to immediately, how am I going to pay my mortgage? How am I going to do this? So it's a similar situation with Paul, so he has to come up with I think it's fair to say he was much more comfortable before he was a Christian than after. Tim?
Just the part about where he's given money, he's accepted a gift from Philippians, and they've sent him gifts of a blessing of 9 no more than once in Philippians 4, 15 and 16.
So Paul gives a few examples in verses 19 to 23. I want to give a few examples, then I want to talk about life today. So this doesn't stay in first century Corinth, but it comes to 21st century Olympia. Paul says that he gave an example about how he doesn't take pay, and he went on for a long time, and he even made sure to say, listen, I'm not writing this so you do give me money. It's not like a passive aggressive sort of thing. Paul makes sure that they understand that, but he gives some more examples here. I'm in Acts chapter 9. That's why nothing actually makes sense. Okay, let me go to 1 Corinthians 9, he gives an example about Verse 19, for though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. To the Jews I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law. I'll give you some examples of how Paul obeyed the Old Testament law in certain circumstances in order to get along with people. He decided to give in on some things in order to get along with people. Timothy. Timothy is a guy with a mixed background. In Acts chapter 16, verses 1 to 3, Paul came to Derbe and to Lystra. A disciple was there named Timothy, the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer, but his father was a Greek. Jewish woman and pagan father. He was well spoken of by the brothers at Lystra and Iconium. So he's a believer. So Timothy's a believer in Jesus now. Paul wanted Timothy to accompany him, and he took him and circumcised him because of the Jews who were in those places, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. What do you guys think about that? They're going to evangelize in an area with tons of Greek people. Okay, they know, a lot of people know that Timothy's mom was Jewish and his dad was a pagan, was Greek. Not Greek from the country of Greece, but you're an unbeliever, a pagan, not an Israelite. And so to make it easier for Timothy to minister in the area with so many Jewish people, Paul tells Timothy to get circumcised for the sake of all the Jews who are in the area who at least know the guy. That is an example of Paul being, in this case, Timothy agreeing to give in on something just so you can have a chance to have a conversation about the gospel. The question is it has to be an unimportant thing. You have to be willing to give on an unimportant thing for the sake of other people. Paul talked about that in Corinth. Does it matter, now that Jesus has come, does it matter if you're circumcised or not? Does it matter? Do all Christian boys have to be circumcised to show that they belong to the Lord? No, it's not a thing anymore. It was the old covenant way to show externally that you belong to God, but now it's gone. It's not there anymore. So to Paul, it doesn't, and to God, it doesn't matter. It's meaningless. But so that you can reach the Jewish people who you're going to be preaching to, they're going to listen to Timothy, and all they're going to be thinking is, you're a traitor because your mom is Jewish, and you never even followed the law to begin with. I'm not even going to listen to you. But now, Timothy can go there and start preaching, and when they say, you're a traitor, just like your mentor Paul, your mom was Jewish, you never followed the law, you were never circumcised, he could say, I love God so much that I was, just recently actually, and I do follow the law, I love the law. So now can we actually talk about who Jesus is now? And they'll have to be like, okay, fine. Or maybe they won't, but still, he at least has a way to answer them. I gave an example last week when Paul was arrested. He went to Jerusalem, and James is there, and he tells him, Paul, there's people all over, Jews all over in this church. They hear all these rumors about you. They say you tell people in Gentile areas that the law doesn't matter. And James says, I know you care about the law, and I know it's important to you, but can you please go to the temple and participate in this ceremony for a Nazirite vow so that we can point to it and tell everyone that you actually do obey the law of God? And Paul says yes, for the sake of the Jewish Christians in the church to whom it was still a really important thing to follow some of the ceremonial things in the Old Testament. And Paul said, yes, I'll do that. And then when he goes in, he's arrested once he goes in. But the point is, he's willing to give a little. He could have said, no, Jesus has come, this is foolishness, and then there would have been a huge church fight, and he probably wouldn't have been able to stay there. But for the sake of peace, he's willing to give on something that's, unimportant for the sake of the gospel. Yeah, I think he knew. That's why he met with like the elders in Ephesus in Acts 20, and he's giving these tearful goodbyes. I think he knows that it's not going to end well. I don't think he knows exactly how, but I think he has an idea that it's not going to end well. He talks about to Gentiles, he acts like a Gentile. So when he's around Gentiles, he doesn't follow the law. He doesn't follow the ceremonial things. It's not a big deal to him because they'll look at him as a weirdo, as some strange guy who doesn't even know who they are. So now I want to talk about 21st century Olympia. The point is, the thing you're going to give up on, the thing you're going to give in on, it has to be an unimportant thing. It seems that when you look at these two chapters, you need to ask yourself three questions. The first question is this thing that I'm being asked to do, or this thing I'm thinking of giving up, is it important to God or not? The second question would be, if I do this or don't do this, will I lead Christians into, is it possible I'll lead Christians into sin? And the third question seems to be, if I do this, will it help build a bridge to the gospel, for the gospel? And then you have to weigh the answers for all three of these questions and figure out for yourself whether you think you should do it. So I'm trying to make this real in the last 8 minutes. If you, let's pretend you're at work and you're friends with a coworker who's a homosexual, you're genuinely friends with this individual. You work near each other, you speak to each other every day, you're kind to each other, you've really developed a relationship with this individual. And the person decides to invite you to her wedding, to her partner, and says, you guys are genuinely friends. And she says, I know what you believe about Christ, I know your position because you're friends, so but it would really mean a lot to me if you came, but I understand if you don't want to. So if you're a Christian, and you take the principles that Paul's talking about here, what should you do? So this is why this is real. It's not just stuck in first century Corinth. What would you do?
I would say it's no different than being the mother of a daughter who's homosexual.
Okay. So everyone's going to answer this. Some people wouldn't have done what Paul did. They would have said, if I go to the temple and offer and do the Nazirite vow, I'm letting people think, I could be making people think they still have to follow the Mosaic law, but they don't have to, so I won't do it. Paul could have said that, but he didn't. To him, it wasn't. After weighing the options, he didn't think it was important enough to give in on. He thought it was important enough to give on. With this, which is a reality for some people, a coworker who's a friend who's a homosexual invites you to her wedding. So what should you do? If you apply these three questions, is the issue of homosexuality important to God? If you go, could you lead other Christians to sin? Or could you lead other Christians astray by thinking it's okay, by thinking you're endorsing it in some way? Maybe. It's possible. Maybe. Could it be a bridge to build relationships for the sake of the gospel? So you have to decide what to do. But these principles that Paul talks about, that's how you do it. You need to weigh, does God say it's important? And if so, how important is it? And then you have to weigh, will I lead Christians to fall into sin if I do it? And then you have to weigh, if I do this, would I be building a bridge for the gospel? So you have to make a decision. That's why some Christians, you guys heard the cases about baking the cake bakers and the florist. Some Christians would bake the cake, some Christians wouldn't. There are a lot of Christians who disagree. And it's hard. It's hard. A lot of good conservative Bible-believing Christians disagree. But it's a wisdom issue. You have to answer those three questions, and then you have to think about it. And it depends on your context. You're going to have to think. You're going to have to make a decision. Now, no one can make the decision for you, but this is where reality sets in. What if you're really good friends with a person who's, and you live in Oregon, where in certain circumstances, euthanasia is legal for human beings. Your friend has a father who has cancer. It's eating him away. It's awful. Great pain. His father has gone through this. Your friend's father has gone through the steps and has permission to be euthanized legally. And your friend asks you to be there with her for support while her father is euthanized. What are you supposed to do? What are you supposed to do? It's the same calculus, the same questions. Is human life important to God? Yeah, so it clearly is important. Could you lead Christians astray or lead unbelievers astray by thinking you condone this kind of behavior if you go? Maybe. Is it a way to build a bridge to the gospel and continue a relationship with the people who are there? Or your friend? Yeah. So you would have to decide how you apply this basic principle, be willing to deny yourself unimportant things for the sake of others. You have to decide whether it's unimportant enough to do. With a clear conscience before God, with all of these things swirling around in your mind.
Well, even Jesus loves them, the person that is suffering. I think we love the people, we just don't like the actions, in my opinion.
Yeah, the crux would be, is the issue unimportant enough for me to go? That seems to be really the sort of the hinge, because circumcision was not important to God anymore because Jesus has come. Obeying the Old Testament law, the ceremonial law, was not important to God anymore because Jesus has fulfilled it, which is why Paul had no problem changing his behavior and accommodating himself depending on who he's talking to. But with these issues, you really have to think, is this unimportant to God? And if not, then you really need to think very carefully about what you would do. But that is how, this is how 1 Corinthians 8 and 9 becomes real for you. Take these principles and think about your life, your friends, your coworkers, your neighbors, and think about situations you might be in or have already been in. Think about situations Claudia's been in, who's shared her context about her daughter to at least some people. So this is real. It's not an abstract thing in Corinth. It goes beyond the meat and the idol thing. You can apply it to your life. Tim.
Okay, well, Linda Sue went through that, and she went down to her friend in Oregon, and she talked to her about the sanctity of life, how God had given us life to try to talk her friend out of doing that and coming to Christ. So that was her purpose for going, and I think if we go with that purpose, you can do that. As far as the homosexual marriage thing, at some point you have to say, this is sin, and I'm not getting involved in this.
Yeah, and I didn't even know that, I'd forgotten that Linda Sue went through that when I brought it up. I just brought it up as this could happen here, and it has. Even in a congregation that's not that big, you have someone whose life has been touched by that exact same scenario. So we have to be faithful enough to God that we need to draw a line somewhere, but we also need to be thinking about how we impact the people around us for the sake of Christ so that we don't say no to everything. It really takes wisdom, input from people you trust, from your elders, your pastors, and your Christian friends in the congregation and outside, and prayer to really think about how do I apply because you can't just, this is not a formula. You can't just apply 2 + 2 = 4, bam, I'm not going. Maybe sometimes it's that simple, but it's complicated. It really is complicated stuff. This is a hard question to answer. But this situation Paul is talking about is just as hard for him. It's just as hard for him. And we have the same problems here today. For Paul, he didn't take a salary in Corinth because of the issues. That must have been really hard for him, 1.5 years. Must have been really hard for him. I'm sure people had him over for lunch, but it must have been really hard for the guy. Other people wouldn't have done that. Other people would have said, you guys are just so messed up, I'm just leaving. And it wouldn't have really necessarily been wrong, because it is a messed up church. But to Paul, and to his situation and his personality and context, he was willing to put up with that for the sake of the gospel. Everything's not black and white. There's a lot of gray. Things aren't always very simple. Life is messy and life is hard. And that's how we apply these principles to today. Anyone else have any thoughts?
I just want to say one more question on my daughter. It's not something that I took lightly when I found out. It was something that I had to wrestle with for a number of years. But because she's my daughter and because I love her, I'm not going to turn my back on her. And if anybody feels differently about me because of it, that's your problem.
So this is hard stuff. For Paul, when we read about the idols and everything, it seems simple because it's not a thing in our society. But for Paul, it's really hard. These are hard decisions he had to make. And he's giving examples of real life situations so that people he wrote the letter to could think about their own lives. And they might not apply these principles the same way Paul would have applied it. Some of you would not bake the cake if you were the baker. Some of you would. It's not necessarily means one right is and one is wrong, because these are really hard issues. But the principle is you need to be willing to deny yourself unimportant things for the sake of others. And you're going to have to decide when something is unimportant enough to deny yourself for. And it's hard, but the Scriptures have given us, Paul has given us principles to think about. So let's pray. We've gone a few minutes over and prepare for the morning worship hour. Dear Lord, we come to you today in Jesus' name. Thank you for your Scriptures. I pray your Holy Spirit can lead us for discernment when we face difficult decisions. Help us to want to deny ourselves for the sake of the gospel, for the sake of protecting other Christians. Help us to be wise to know when to do that, how to do it the right way. Help us to seek advice from people we know and trust. And most of all, lead us just to want to deny ourselves for the sake of other people, for the gospel and for other people's growth